Although some things definitely haven't changed, anime conventions nowadays are pretty different from cons back in the 2000s. I don't even mean that just in terms of their size or availability, but just, the culture of anime conventions was incredibly different than it is now. For example, Naruto was definitely and without question the most cosplayed thing around. Glomping was a thing that happened, a very painful thing, actually. Yeah, it was definitely an interesting time for anime fan culture, but when I think of the hallmarks that made 2000s anime conventions just inherently different, perhaps nothing really encapsulates how different they were better than the Yaoi paddle. Now, some of you may remember seeing these hellish devices around conventions and are probably wincing because you just realized that I unrepressed your awful memories of them. But then, some of you, on the other hand, might have been lucky enough to not start going to cons until after they began to disappear. So now you may be thinking, okay, so what exactly is the Yaoi paddle? If they were so awful, then why did so many people bring them to conventions? And for that matter, when and why did they stop? And that's what I'm here with you to discuss today. Let's talk about the rise and fall of the Yaoi paddle. So before we talk about the history of the Yaoi paddle, first we need to know what it is. After all, they've basically been wiped off the earth at this point. So the Yaoi paddle is, well god, honestly, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a glossy wooden paddle that says Yaoi on it. And if you don't know what Yaoi is, I'm gonna have to ask you to Google that one yourself because I want to keep this video ad-friendly. There were also variants that said Seme or Uke on it that were fairly popular. Yuri paddles were a thing too, but none of them ever quite took off in the same way Yaoi paddles did. Anyways, so people would just bring these paddles to cons and they'd literally just spank people with them. Sometimes it was characters that they liked Yaoi of, sometimes it was just whoever was unfortunate enough to walk by them at the wrong time. There were no set rules to these paddles, so some people would just spank without rhyme or reason. And I know what you're thinking, well, that's absolutely absurd. Wouldn't that hurt the cosplayer? Didn't security do anything about it? And in order, the answers are very often and basically never. Getting spanked because you were in cosplay was unfortunately a very real fear that a lot of cosplayers had at the time, and yes, it was just as insane as it sounds. The cosplay isn't consent movement just wasn't around when Yaoi paddles were at their peak, and a lot of people just didn't have a good sense of boundaries at these cons. And since most anime conventions just weren't super huge yet, security wasn't anything like it is now. It was lesser and it was laxer. There were still weapon checks, sure, but that was generally the only place you'd see security people at a con. And even then, most conventions didn't consider these paddles to be weapons, so a person could easily get one of these paddles into the con anyways. So this whole thing is starting to sound kind of awful, right? Well, yeah, it kind of was. So about now, you may be wondering, well, if everyone hated these paddles so much, then how come they were everywhere? What made them so popular in the first place? And for that matter, how did they even come into being? Let's talk about the rise of the Yaoi paddle. There's a lot of questions about the origins of the Yaoi paddle, and none of them are sufficiently answered in any single spot, so I did what any aspiring historian would do. I went directly to the source to find out. And what that means is I got into contact with Hendane, and you'll learn who they are in just a moment, and I asked them to tell me what they could about the Yaoi paddle, and they were more than generous about sharing information with me. So by combining the information that Hendane gave me with a few other important findings online, I think I've got it. I think I've made the first and right now only comprehensive history of the Yaoi paddle. So that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. The first Yaoi paddle was made by a man named Michael Bergi, who made it as a joke gift for the owner of Hendane, which was a booth that sold doujinshi, mostly Yaoi doujins, at conventions. The older con-goers watching this video might remember their booth by their trademark screaming in the middle of dealers' rooms, which I'm happy to report that they no longer do. They are still still around and still selling doujins at cons, by the way. In fact, a good portion of the information I got from them for this video came from talking to them face to face at their booth at Anime Boston, but I digress. Our story begins in either 2002 or 2003. Nobody seems to be completely sure. It was at YaoiCon, and it was just a paddle with the word yaoi burnt into it. Just a simple joke gift made on a whim because wood paddles were on sale. And perhaps it was the humorous nature of the gift. Perhaps it was the fact that it was at a yaoi convention, or perhaps it was the volume of the salespeople. But for whatever reason, the paddle attracted a lot of attention, and it was said that it helped bolster sales for Hendane. So as much as Hendane was seeming to enjoy the gift, the con attendees seemed to enjoy it even more. So much more, in fact, that Hendane bought the rights to mass produce them shortly after that. And so Anime Expo 2004 was the first con that they were sold at. This was effectively Yaoi Paddle Ground Zero. They sold about 50 of them, and then they brought them to Otakon the same year, and that's where they really took off. From there, the Yaoi Paddle fever started to set in, and they'd reach their peak between 2005 and 2007. Hendane would usually be able to sell about 200 per con, but that was just at a typical con. There were others where they'd be able to sell a paddle a minute at times. They'd have to stuff them into suitcases with a maximum capacity believed to be at around 500. These numbers only get all the more incredible when you realize that Hendane was at pretty much every major con across North America, and then even some overseas. And where Hendane was, suitcases full of their signature yaoi paddles were there with them. And where yaoi paddles were, profits wouldn't be far behind. In fact, I was told of an incident where one of the aforementioned suitcases full of yaoi paddles got lost in receivership in Toronto. Someone else must have found it and ended up selling its contents for a few hundreds of dollars, which is even more astounding when you remember that Hendane sold them for $35 each. But regardless of where they bought them, there were people who bought them because they thought they were funny, people who thought they'd make good cosplay props, and eventually some people started buying them because, well, everyone else had one. And there were people who just had them as props for their costumes and never actually spanked anyone. There were people who only spanked others when they had permission, and even then would only lightly tap them. You know, most yaoi paddle owners seemed to use them responsibly, but unfortunately, there were also people who took the joke a little more seriously. They would spank without consent, without any regard for boundaries, and often without any mercy. People got hurt, emotionally and physically. Complaints were made, and eventually, well, those complaints just started to pile up. Let's talk about the fall of the yaoi paddle. The yaoi paddle, although a source of joy for some and a source of revenue for Hendane, was also a considerable source of pain for many con-goers. I asked Hendane what the worst yaoi paddle injury they know of is, and they told me of this incident that happened at Otakon one year. So what happened was, an attendee saw someone cosplaying a character that they really liked, a bishi that they found quite kawaii, if you will. So then, how does a con attendee get the attention of such a cosplayer, perhaps approaching them and politely saying, "Hello, I am a big fan of this character, and your cosplay looks great. Would you mind if I were to take a picture of you?" Well, that's what you should do, at least, but clearly that's not what this person did. So you may be thinking, okay, well, they probably just spanked him with the paddle then, right? Well, that's what many paddle-wielding attendees with a poor sense of boundaries might have done, yes, but I guess that just wasn't enough for this particular attendee. This particular attendee who would do something that even the most ill-mannered attendee would still tell you not to do. This person, this buffoon, got a running start and spanked the cosplayer with the side of their paddle. Yeah, not the front and not the back, the side, the edge, the single most painful part of it. That poor, unsuspecting cosplayer's pelvis was completely shattered upon impact. Hendane then told me that last they heard, this cosplayer was still in a wheelchair and the paddler was in prison. And even though that's definitely an extreme for the yaoi paddle, the fact of the matter is that even though most people seem to use their paddles at least mostly responsibly, not everyone else did. The irresponsible paddlers were armed and pretty dangerous. And by 2007, the rest of the con-going community was starting to get openly fed up with it. The fun and novelty of the yaoi paddle were gone, and they left only bruises and pain in their wake. The age of the yaoi paddle needed to come to an end, and so the first con to finally ban the yaoi paddle was SakuraCon 2007. And why did they do this, you may be wondering? Because there were attendees who started spanking hotel staff. Yeah, not con staff, but the hotel staff. And anyone who knows anything about running a con will tell you that if you're looking for a pretty quick way to get your con in serious trouble, yeah, pissing off the venue is a pretty effective way to do it. So SakuraCon's yaoi paddle ban was made in 2007, but they wouldn't start actually enforcing it until 2008. And from there, it was kind of like a domino effect, and by 2010, they were banned at pretty much every major convention in North America. As a matter of fact, they got banned so hard at Anime North in particular that even today, a decade later, they still explicitly mention that yaoi paddles are banned from the con on their website. The only major con that seemed to lag behind was MCM in London, where it got so bad that there were actually a few petitions to get them banned from as recently as 2012. I couldn't find any posts explicitly saying that yaoi paddles got banned from MCM, but in 2013, posts about them being there disappeared. But although I'm not 100% sure when it happened, paddles are on MCM's current weapon ban list, so it looks like the petitions were successful. So how did Hendane respond to this sudden blanket-wide ban? Allow me to directly quote them. Quote, "At first our response was, well, we'll sell them with the idea that as soon as you bought it, it had to go in your car or hotel. This worked for a short time until conventions considered them weapons and we had to deal with a whole new process of either applying as a weapons vendor, not an easy thing, or just dropping them altogether. So we dropped them from production and from cons. The last con we sold paddles at was in 2011 in Denmark. I believe the convention was called J-PopCon. We would have sold the remaining paddles we had after, but due to a shipping error, the final batch of paddles, a bag of about 45 of them, was entirely lost. Whether or not the bag still exists anywhere is a good question." End quote. So, in other words, what I'm getting from this is that somewhere out there in the world, there's essentially a buried treasure chest of 45 yaoi paddles just waiting to be discovered. The final farewell to the yaoi paddle. It's a literal time capsule that'll thoroughly confuse whoever finds it if it really does exist. That's probably the absolute weirdest and yet most fitting ending to this story that I could possibly think of. But currently the year is 2019. I honestly can't remember the last time I saw a yaoi paddle at a con, but they are, in any case, an interesting slice of convention history, and I hope you enjoyed this odd little video about them because it took a lot of time and effort to get all this info together. Literally, it took about a year, but I think the result is worth it. The yaoi paddle era of conventions truly was a weird one, especially in hindsight, but let's not repeat this history. As a matter of fact, let's learn from all this. For starters, don't take con security for granted, folks, and while you're at it, respect people's boundaries, especially if those people are cosplaying. And perhaps, most importantly, somewhere out there in the world, probably in the same abyss that other lost masterpieces like the Just Judges panel, the Storm at the Sea of Galilee, or Raphael's Portrait of a Young Man are, there might also be a bag, a metaphoric gold mine full of yaoi paddles, and it's just sitting there collecting dust, waiting to be discovered. The hunt is on. No, but for real, do I get the title First Yaoi Paddle Historian or not? 'Cause I want it.